Well, here's a game as black playing against white, and he does a queen's pawn opening, which I hate defending against queen's pawn for some reason. I made a huge mistake mid-game and lost a very important piece. And here we go, off to the races. He does the queen's pawn to d4. I respond with the d5 queen's pawn to halt his attack and to control my own center of the board. He pushes the c pawn forward to c4, as in boom goes the dynamite. And I'm going to push my b knight up to c6, the c6 knight move. If he's going to take the pawn on d5, well, then I'm going to use my queen, and he takes what? So I push my queen up. I'm controlling a lot of the center here. My queen's exposed. It's not a great place, but I'll probably just move her right back where she came from soon enough. Let's see what he does. He pushes the knight f3, thus protecting that pawn. And I push up to challenge the pawn. If he takes here, then I'm going to take his queen and put his king into an awkward position, and he'll lose his right to castle. He decides to back the pawn further with his black bishop. What am I going to do? I put him in check because look at him. He's all holed in there. He's going to have to move something up to block that. And he does a joint attack and defend move because he's attacking my queen. Now, I don't necessarily have to do anything because I haven't pinned. During the game, though, I was like, well, shit, I have to take him because he's going to get my queen. Not even realizing that I goofed. He's pinned. I don't have to move. Regardless, I take. He takes back with his pawn. And I don't have much going here. I decide to push onto his knight. Well, he decides to go for an exchange. We're going to be trading knights here. And he's exposing the queen attack that I have available now. However, he's backed up with a rook. It's no longer an advantage. He doesn't have to move the king at all. I consider moving my queen over to a5 to put pressure on that pawn, but I decide, go ahead, take this pawn and even up the material game and put pressure on the c3 pawn at the same time. He puts me in check. Whammo. I'm going to move my bishop back to protect as well as threaten his queen, and he's pushing his queen up to the d4 square in order to push for a queen exchange. If I take his queen, his bishop gets to occupy the d4 square next, and then my g7 pawn is extremely vulnerable, and the poor rook behind him is trapped and will be under attack with nothing I can do. I'm screwed here. What I should have done is move my queen to f6. If I move the queen to f6, then if he exchanges queens, then I get to move my jumpy up to the f6 square and thus develop a piece during the exchange. What I do instead is make a huge fucking mistake, and I move the queen back to e7, thus exposing the g7 pawn that I was needing to protect desperately. He takes that g7 pawn, and my rook is now about to be royally fucked. I push my queen up in a desperate attempt to stay balanced somehow, and I realize he's going to push his bishop up to threaten the queen. I'm in a really bad spot, and I have to exchange queens. He's going to get my rook on top of that. Really hurts, and I decide to castle there so I can at least have a chance of controlling the d file with my rook after he takes my rook. He takes the rook. I try to trap him by moving the pawn up, as that f6 square is covered by my knight. I expect him to try to move the rook over to take the d file. Instead, he pushes a pawn up. Whatever. He wants to let his white bishop out. Duh. So I put pressure on that e file because I want to push the f pawn up. And he backs up that pawn with his f pawn, and now I push up. He can't take. That pawn's pinned, but I have released his bishop. And that bishop can come to get to me. Instead, he activates the white bishop, putting pressure on my jumpy. I move it up into the h6 square, where I can more protect the f5 pawn. And he attacks again. Now my jumpy is really trapped, and I'm totally screwed. I don't have anywhere I can move the jumpy, so I'm going to lose him. So I decided to go ahead and push on the pawn line he's developing here. He's going to take that jumpy and take that bait, and I continue to take another pawn. Shit, now he's in check, and he can't take my pawn back. What's he going to do? He moves up to threaten the pawn. I decide to take again. He should probably just take with his king right here, but he decides to move the rook over to threaten my rook. If I trade rooks, then he's going to be in a great spot, owning an open e file, and I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to go ahead and push for a queen here. He's going to take with what? I figure maybe the rook. But he uses the king instead. Maybe he thinks I'll push for the rook exchange now, but I'm not going to. I'm going to push onto that exposed king. And he makes the fatal error and pushes himself into the corner. I realize it, and my bishop has him in check. The g-file's locked down by my rook. He can't move. He is so fucked. He desperately attempts to block this attack, but I take. He has nothing. He blocks again, and bam. Poor Logan, 463, trying to claw above 1,300. He's not going to make it today, folks. Not with me in the water. That's all I got.